Hello everybody, today on the channel, a car once upon a time a very common sight on the roads of Britain, but now a genuine rarity, a Vauxhall Cavalier SRI 130. Just to get my younger viewers up to speed, the Cavalier was, I suppose, a mid-level car sold by Vauxhall from 1975 till 1995 in 3 different generations. The truth is, by the time I was old enough to start paying attention to cars, which would be the late 90s, early 2000s, even the 3rd generation Cavalier was already a car that didn't have a particularly sexy reputation and was already something of a rarity. In truth, even by the early 90s, these 2nd generation cars, produced from 81 till 88, were already almost extinct. The 1st generation Cavalier was based on the Opel Ascona, as was the 2nd. However, the early car did have some distinct visual touches to separate it from its European equivalent. For the 2nd generation of car, there was essentially no difference whatsoever between this and an Ascona, bar the badging and the trim levels offered. At its introduction in 1981, the Cavalier dealt a hammer blow to the then aging Cortina, which by that time was in its 5th generation. This was, in apparently all the ways that mattered to a fleet manager, a fine car, and the British bosses of Vauxhall were very keen to point out that with this generation of Cavalier, they could rival the quality of the European-built Ascona. In 1982, Ford's answer to the 2nd gen Cavalier arrived in the form of the Sierra. Though it took the public a little while to adjust to that car's, for the time, particularly radical looks, it was a big seller, and for the remainder of the decade, the Sierra and the Cavalier duked it out as Britain's car of choice, with each taking turns at being our best-selling model. All in, 800,000 of these 2nd generation Cavaliers were sold, but today, very few remain. This absolutely gorgeous example has been brought to me by a lovely chap called John, who's friends with a man called Gordon, who's friends with a man that I know called Dominic. So thanks to everybody for making this happen. In truth, though I mock the Cavalier for being desperately uncool, I've actually been looking forward to driving this for quite a while. It is a really nicely preserved example, though preserved is perhaps a strong word, because this was purchased in 2015 and it was a wreck. Many hours of work over many years went into getting this car to the standard you now see. It is exactly as original, down to the exhaust system and even the Philips cassette radio here. You must excuse me, I had a moment there. I looked over and for a second I was once again 6 years old, because I saw the mechanism for undoing the sunroof. It's the old-fashioned twist it one way to pop it up, twist it the other way to undo it. It has been so long since I've seen a car with that mechanism in it, I've rather forgotten, but the moment I saw it, I was transported back to a very different time. And indeed, the rest of the interior does transport you back to a different time as well. This is a feast of not leather. It's fabric with some very unusual material for the doors and the seat centers, but is very much of the period. Curiously, and this is where I struggle with explaining older cars like this, SRI was the trim. 130 was the engine. It was the most powerful of all the engines available, an 8-valve 2-litre unit related to the one found in the Vauxhall Astra GTE. That actually made a little bit less power. The exhaust here apparently let it make a few more horses. In truth, the next most powerful Cavalier made 115 horsepower, so it's not like this was a massive increase, but you have to remember this is a naturally aspirated car from a very different time. Back then, getting 15 horsepower more out of a car wasn't particularly easy. If you think of it instead as a 10% gain in power, I suppose it sounds a little bit more impressive. As it happens, I'm actually also really impressed with this 5-speed manual gearbox. Though it looks very typical of the period and feels slightly weird in the hand, it's a delight. There is very little play in it. The action is nice, very precise. Even the throw isn't all that long. It's beautiful to use. A real highlight that I did not expect. The turning circle is very good. This car's currently got some very odd issues. It doesn't idle all that brilliantly, and the rev count, well, let's put it this way. It thinks I'm doing 3,500 revs now. I promise you I'm not. And before we carry on talking about trim levels, let's have a little bit of fun, shall we? I feel a bit like I'm driving one of those Japanese tuner specials, and before you think I've gone mad, the only reason for that is that the rev needle is pretty much all the way off the end of the gauge most of the time. Old cars, hey? Anyway, so I was talking about trim levels. This is the most powerful engine, the 130, as indicated by those beautiful red graphics on the side that I'm sure meant a lot to some people. However, SRI is not. There were many other trim levels, and I believe CDI may have been the most luxurious. So in this car, you do not have AC, you've got a heater, you've got a cassette, you've got FM radio, but you do not have electric seats, you do not have electric window, you do not have an electric sunroof. It's pretty basic. Something like a Senator or Carlton would have been far more upmarket at the time. The sort of person I imagine this would have appealed to is your young man about town who's getting a company car and could have something a little bit more luxurious, but instead is more interested in the sporty potential. Not that there is an awful lot of sporty potential in a 130 horsepower front-wheel drive car, and oh my word, with that sunroof popped a little bit open, it makes the most horrendous noise. Oh, no, right, okay, you're there, and in fact, no, I'm going to leave you open. You're going to stay open. Ride quality is pleasant, although over some of the lumps and bumps it does judder and rattle a little bit more than I would have expected. Overall grip level is also somewhat low. However, Gordon told me when he was young he remembered seeing these and was amazed by the incredibly wide 185 section tyres. In those stakes, as far as he was concerned, the Cavalier was bested only by a Capri 2.8 because that had 205 rears, and for a young man back then that was like looking at the back of a Lamborghini Countach. Come on, old girl. Yeah, quite a bit of play in the steering, not particularly precise. Brakes are reasonable, they work quite well. I love the little clock down here too, that's a joy. I love the cassette holders even more. There's something about those, I think they would have been the same as in my granddad's Vauxhall Astrovan, which is why I've got so much of a nostalgic thing going for them. I also adore the fact that it is in the blue that I seem to remember every single Vauxhall of this period being in. I know that they weren't, but for some reason in my head, I've just remembered it that way. And I would also, at this point in time, like to ask anybody that owned one of these back in the day to tell me if they have any particular memories of it, fond or otherwise. Did you enjoy this? Was this a real treat? Or was it something you were lumbered with and wouldn't want to be seen dead in? Visibility is very good, as is typical of cars for the time. Everything's pretty much squared off, A pillars, B pillars, all very thin, so it really doesn't matter where they put them because there's not much of them to get in your way. The 130 is in of itself something of a curio because it didn't last all that long. It was introduced just about 18 months before this model was discontinued and replaced with the third generation car in 1988. I'm told that the engine was actually designed really more for that car than this, but I suppose they felt this was a way of keeping the model fresh and interesting. For all of its flaws, the car is actually doing a very good job of getting down the road. It was only in the tighter sections earlier where it seemed to really struggle for grip, the front tyres being overloaded pretty quickly. The first generation of Cavalier had been front engine with rear wheel drive, as was typical for cars of the 70s, but this, being a product of the 1980s, moved to the then increasingly common front engine front wheel drive. A number of body styles were available for this car. This is the most common, a hatchback. There was also a saloon, which is the car I most imagine when people talk about a Cavalier, and there was also an estate, though I believe very, very few people actually bought one of those. I can't even think what one looks like. As to what this car is worth, it's pretty hard to say. Even so, I expect the answer is some thousands of pounds rather than tens of thousands of pounds. And though it's not a car that you're likely ever to see in the JayEmm on Cars fleet, I have to say I've really appreciated having a go in this because it's actually a genuine delight. Really enjoyed this, and I hope, if nothing else, it's managed to perhaps bring back a few memories for people. I'm hoping nice ones. A shorter video than usual, but I hope you've enjoyed a little drive out in this 1988 Vauxhall Cavalier SRI 130. A big thank you to John for bringing it along. As ever, thanks to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and even if you have, make sure you've pressed the bell icon so you'll be notified of every single video release. I'll see you all for the next one. Bye-bye.